You want to do them in order so that there's no settled questions related to them?
Probably is,
Is there a specific order you prefer?
looking at them, I don't think there would be though.
Doesn't matter.
I don't think there would be.
Okay.
We do them in order of their numbers.
Representative left side.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to hear a little bit more conversation. Whereas, so I've got 11 L001. Let's see, which one of the three are you referring to, Representative Melton? Because I've got 4 in front of me. I'm not sure.
You mentioned in order, right? Salazar?
Yes, Madam Chair. None of them would be a settled question issue, however you can.
So thank you, Madam Chair. So I'll move L001 and ask for a second, and then ask Representative Salazar to explain that one.
L001 has been moved. Who has seconded?
The bill has a drafting error in it. We've indicated all along that this is a mandatory change for counties and cities and municipalities. And the way that it was drafted, it says state are encouraged not to enact. Well, that doesn't mean anything. You can encourage whoever you want to do anything. But this makes it mandatory, that's exactly what it was supposed to have been in the original bill. I ask for my vote.
Are there further questions on this amendment? Is there any objection to this amendment? Representative Sang.
I have an objection.
Okay, there's Representative Art.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me get this straight. Sorry, because this changes the bill substantially, correct? From is encouraged not to shall not, right? I just want to be crystal clear.
Representative Salazar.
It does change it to mandatory language, yes.
Thank you.
Further questions? Would you have an objection to this amendment, L001? So we're going to have to call the roll for the vote. Damian?
Representative Art.
No.
Anderson.
Yes.
Kleinschmidt.
No.
Navarro.
No.
Ransom. Rosenthal.
Yes.
Singh.
No.
Singh.
Yes.
Burrow.
No.
Website.
Yes.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Stupid trick.
That amendment fails 5-6. Representative left side.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and
Take the power out of the bill out of an administration error.
I move L005, and it looks like what we're doing here is striking discrimination and substituting with the word harassment. Second.
So that
Creating a new protected class, and then it strikes the word discrimination and replaces it with harassment on page 5, which is defined specific to this bill. And I would ask for my vote.
is there further questions regarding this amendment, L005? Is there objection? Representative Sang has objected, so we need to call for the vote. Damian, please call the roll.
Madam Chair, if we might, Representative Arndt, did Representative Arndt have a question?
No, Madam Chair, just ask for a minute because it says strike lines 1 through 8, so I'm just looking to see what that does.
Sure. We're going to request, so we're going to take some more time to review that amendment as it relates to
Madam Chair.
page 4. Representative Salazar.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, sorry about that. So this amendment was brought at the request of Representative Kleinschmidt, and after speaking with the coalition, they were good with this amendment.
Thank you for that explanation. Representative Arndt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could you just give us a brief explanation of what it does?
Representative Salazar, Representative Melton, could you just recap?
Yeah, so basically it takes away the definition of discrimination based on housing status. That's what it does. I mean, there's really no statement in here that says discrimination based on housing status, except when you look at page 5, line 17, it says is to be free from discrimination. And so what we're doing is we're taking out discrimination and discrimination based on housing status And we're changing on page 5, line 17, discrimination to harassment, which is defined on page 4, lines 12 through 18.
Representative Smith, can you explain the rationale why you wanted to make this amendment?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe discrimination is an entirely different part of the Colorado statute. They have certain protected class, starting with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. People shall not be discriminated on the basis of gender or on the basis of race. Recently, Colorado added sexual orientation. If we add homelessness as a protected class, I think it opens a can of worms to a different set of triggers, a different set of enforcement standards, and suddenly you get the Civil Rights Commission involved. And I just don't think this bill intends to go down that road, and I don't think it's a good fit. But I'm totally in favor of protecting people from harassment, and I think that is a suitable substitute for the intent of this bill.
Thanks for that explanation. Representative Melton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We do find that amendment friendly. We agree that we do not intend to create a new protected class. However, we do intend to protect people from harassment.
Great. Further question on amendment L005? Is there the role for Damien?
Representative Smart,
Yes.
Anderson,
Yes.
Blanchard,
Yes.
Navarro,
Yes.
Ransom,
Yes.
Rosenthal. Singh.
No.
Singer,
Yes.
Thurlow. No. Lepson,
Yes.
Madam Chair.
Yes. That passes 9-2. Singer,
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move amendment L006.
it has been moved and seconded by
Second.
Representative Lepson. Please explain L006.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. L006, what this says is it says that if any county, city, municipality, or other subdivision, if they can provide housing, and I think we're defining that as appropriate and adequate housing based on a particular person's circumstances, then that would exempt them from this bill. So that would allow them to continue to enforce their ordinance if they can provide a substitute. And with that, I would ask for another vote.
Representative Singer?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the bill sponsors for entertaining this. I know I've been, hashing this out in my head for a long time, and if the crux of the issue is that there are sufficient services available to serve a community but those services are not being taken advantage of, then that's one question. If those services are provided to a community, then I think we're dealing with a different situation. And so if people are arguing that there's adequate and available housing and people are not availing themselves of it, then this provides that protection to say whether you're, regardless of what's going on in your particular circumstances, whether you're in a wheelchair and they have wheelchair accessible housing for you, whether you're disabled in a different way and have a disability, that you have the effective housing for that individual. It provides that protection so that if cities do still believe that there needs to be other bans or ordinances, that they can go ahead and say, you know what, we're taking care of our population here in city of X or county of X, and now because of that, the remainder of the bill would basically be made null and void.
Further question? Representative Ransom, and then I'll come on down. Yes, Representative Ransom?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question of the sponsors. Can I?
Sure.
And this is also kind of a piggyback on what Representative Singer said, and also some of what I heard said by some of the witnesses this evening. But it said, this amendment says that if the city, county, municipality offers these other services, but what if it's one of the other private groups that we heard mention of? Because, and the report that we were given mentions other groups that offer housing, Salvation Army, Red Cross, various church groups. So
It's
if
those other
they're
groups that do it all and
available,
the city
but
takes
not
credit for it.
available by the city or county, would they still be, exempt from it? But just as importantly, and this, let me piggyback on that question, is the appropriate and adequate housing. I know I heard some of the people say that there are housing and mats and stuff available, but they didn't like them because there were things like bed bugs and lice. And I mean, if that's what we have available, then it's just tough to define appropriate and adequate. And I guess I want something officially how we would define that.
Representative Melton?
That it offered the person experiencing. The reason why, so basically, because you're asking about like nonprofit and private entities, they wouldn't be able to cite someone else. The only person that would be able to cite someone or arrest someone would be someone within the city, county, or the government subdivision. So, so if the officer, if a law enforcement officer approached a person, and they said, let's get you off the street, we have a camping van, here we can take you to here or here, and it meets adequate and appropriate housing, they would be the person that would be citing, not a private entity. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question the way you're kind of asking it, but.
Yeah, I think what Representative Ransom is asking about is, when we talk about the nonprofits, those could be potential resources. And I'm just wondering, how do you operationalize this for law enforcement? Have they had a chance to, will they be briefed and someone will give them a list of these are all the resources in that city or in that county? Representative Salazar?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and if you take a look, Representative Ransom, at page 6, lines 21 through 26, Representative Melton is right, is that it's the county, the city, the municipality that has the police powers to issue citations and to make arrests. And I'm sure that these city, counties, and municipalities work hand in hand with nonprofit organizations, but under this bill, nonprofit organizations are not obligated to have to provide those services for when the rules or policies of the provider disqualify the person from receiving the services. So, so that's the other aspect of it. So if the city, the county, or the municipality has the services available, and the person doesn't avail themselves of that service, then these ordinances would be triggered. If they don't have the services and the housing to provide to persons who are experiencing homelessness, then these ordinances cannot be triggered. So this language is a triggering effect, and I think Representative Singer has, because he was the one who came to us on the amendment. I think he may have further explanation if you need further explanation.
Representative Furlong?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, representatives. Same subject for me. Isn't it awful arbitrary language? It's going to make the determinations of whether the community has the facilities and what does it mean that if they're appropriate and adequate housing based on a person's particular circumstance. Isn't that an awful lot of subjective judgment, either on the city itself or on the police officer or on somebody to be an effective law?
Representative Melton, or?
Thank you, Chair, or Representative Singer. I think Representative Singer actually gave a good example of, say, someone that was in a wheelchair. If housing is available, but it's not wheelchair accessible, that would be adequate or appropriate, given that person's personal circumstances. So I think the language does need to kind of remain, I would say, somewhat broad in order for someone to be able to address different types of situations or circumstances that may arise.
Representative Singer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think there's a few more questions about the amendment, so instead of, me answering part of the question, I'll happily defer to other people who have questions. I'll just say right now, I'm assuming by your questions, you actually support the concept, but would just like it further fleshed out.
Representative Singh?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to vote yes on this amendment because it is congruent with the spirit of the bill and what it's trying to do.
Besides, the teeth got taken out on what you already voted for, and what you already voted against.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. No, I don't support the amendment because I just don't support us putting all this squishy language in the bill. You could give an example of somebody that's in a wheelchair and that might be fine, but how many different things could happen under that kind of language? So that just doesn't seem like a very good set of piece of language to put in a law.
Yes, and thank you very much, Madam Chair. Why people experience homelessness, it could be, and that's why it's very individualized, such as the gentleman here who talked about his mom being mentally disabled and he became homeless. Or we heard the gentleman here who was talking about substance abuse issues. Or we hear some of the ladies talking about domestic abuse or running away from domestic abuse. We don't know those things. That's why, and sounds to me like from the way that the cities were talking, they seem to be very adept on being able to take a look at a person's individualized circumstance. I'm not so certain that we can craft language that fits everybody as a whole. That's why it's stated the way that it is. Representative Singer may also have further instruction on it.
So my question is that we may not crack the perfect bill, but maybe, I'm wondering, how do we measure this? I mean, how do we ensure that this is being done? Because it sounds great, I support it, but I'm already hearing examples over and over again about how police are treating homeless. And so now we want them to treat them with some kind of information about resources, when right now they're kicking people, telling them to move on, but yet we're gonna tell them you have a right to rest. I think this might have some training elements. I'm not quite sure how we make sure that officers across our state.
It's to release the
actually do this.
officers from that.
Representative Singer.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to try and answer this question using education policy for a second. Lobata, everyone's familiar with those cases, right? Our General Assembly is mandated by the Lobato, well, actually by our Constitution and following 2 court cases, to provide a thorough and uniform system of public education. Please define for me thorough and uniform for a second. We can't, because the courts do it for us. What I'm trying to do here is come up with a common definition where we can start to agree. Now, if you disagree with the premise of the amendment in the first place, I understand that and let it live or die on its own merits. If you have a problem with the so-called squishy language, I guess you have a problem with our Constitution requiring a thorough and uniform system of public education. We have these words so we can start a touchstone. Now, I would hope that you would support the amendment and support the bill, and we can further discuss this on the floor. If you don't support the amendment or the bill, then vote no. But if you like the underlying concept, let's keep going with this. I could have said thorough and uniform form of housing, but I guess we have 2 court cases that are still wrangling with that. So we don't always use the most articulate language here because it's a human system. But this is the best we could do. And so I look forward to either letting it live or die on its merits, but if you have a problem with the language, I'm more than amenable to considering this once it gets to the floor.
This amendment idea came up this morning. I think it's a very interesting, and I think it's a step in the very right direction. I'm thinking constantly about this bill as a statewide bill, as we're making state law, and not just city, for where we're sitting now, or any other city that we might have discussed today. So I keep going back to this idea on page 6, that this bill is really for every person, and we established that at the beginning. So if I lived in Salida that had 18,000 people come to that festival last year, and in order to not pass an anti-camping ordinance, I would need to make sure that I offered every person adequate and appropriate housing before I could pass any kind of camping regulation. So this is what I'm just trying to make sure that we remember making a law for the whole state, I mean, I don't know if maybe this would be more appropriate in the city of Denver or Aurora and before a city council. Because some of these issues that are really real and alive, and I'm not saying homelessness doesn't exist in rural areas, it certainly does. It's just a very broad approach with a lot of different facets. And I don't know how a municipality in rural areas could pass a camping ban or restriction in those circumstances. And in this amendment would say they have to prove that they had offered every single person, regardless of their current condition of homelessness, a place to stay. That's a concern for me.
Further question? Representative Melton.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I think I'm going to go back to the intent of the amendment. And the intent of the amendment is, before you go to criminalization, offer every option. And that's, I think, what we've heard over and over again is that I don't have an option. I have no other place to go. I can only sleep outside because I don't own a home, and there aren't enough places in the shelters. And so this just basically says, cities, you want local control, keep local control, but do everything you can do before you turn to citations. It's the way Fort Collins, in fact, Fort Collins said that this is actually modeled after their own program. I definitely can understand some of the concerns. Should this amendment get on and go to the next step, I'd be happy to talk about how we can craft that better. But for the most part, I want to make sure that we're not losing sight of the intent of what the amendment is supposed to do.
Representative Epstein.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I was just going to reiterate what Representative Melton, I think Representative Arndt, I think this amendment is tailored perfectly for Fort Collins. We heard from the council member that he is doing everything that he can, and we heard from Representative Arndt that they're actually providing vouchers, right, for folks who, and so this to me is tailored for a city, a good city like Fort Collins that actually is trying to do the right thing.
Question? Representative Singer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to respond, but what your concern is, in a practical sense, is assuming there were 11,000 or 18,000 people descending at some sort of festival or whatever in Salida, you would have to make the assumption that all 18,000 or 11,000 or 12,000 of those folks were homeless. So an officer, if an officer is saying, you're violating, you can't be here, do you have a place to go? Yes, here's my driver's license, I live at 123 Colfax in Denver. Well, move on home. You can't be here right now. As opposed to, look, you're violating our ban, you can't be here, do you have a place to go? No, I don't have a place to go. Well, here's what we can do for you then. And so I think you're misreading it. Now, if we want to clarify this, we can always have a difference of opinion about the bill. But once again, I'm happy to clarify that in further amendments down the road, assuming this amendment passes and assuming the bill passes.
Representative Singh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think you've talked me past the point of sale, Representative Singer. I think I want to vote no on this now. Let's clarify language on the floor.
Further questions? Do we have any opposition? Yes, we do. So, Damien, call for the vote.
Representative Arndt.
Pass.
Danielson.
Yes.
Schmidt.
Yes.
Navarro. Ransom. Rosenthal.
No.
Singh.
No.
Singer.
Yes.
Thurlow.
No.
Arndt.
Well, I like the intent of the amendment. I'm not convinced it fixes the bill, so I'll vote yes on the amendment to try everything I can to do to strengthen the bill. Yes.
Lepton.
Yes.
Fields. Madam Chair.
Wait a minute, Arndt's the one that weakened the bill by taking out the stronger language of the First Amendment.
Okay, are there any other amendments?
Madam Chair, I'm going to move amendment L008.
you guys seen L008?
No, we have not.
What's going on with that over there?
Closing. Opening.
Okay, Representative, I think we all have a copy. It's already been.
It hasn't been started.
You can check it? L008 has been moved, is it a second? Representative Ransom has seconded L008. Representative Singh, tell us about this amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and this is a very serious issue, and I just want to make sure it's explicit. I was advised that the spaces in this bill would include legislative offices. I just want to make sure that's explicit in the bill.
Representative Salazar.
So I don't know if this amendment is a tongue-in-cheek amendment or if it's a serious amendment.
That's very serious.
Liar.
And the way you're looking at me, does it seem that way?
Should I look differently?
Well, I don't, no, I mean, no, seriously, is this a serious amendment?
Madam Chair? Yes, it is a serious amendment.
All right.
I just want to make sure that we are very explicit that this includes all public spaces.
Madam Chair.
So this is a technical amendment to make the logic congruent with the rest of the bill.
It's a way to kill the bill.
All right, so for the people who are here who have a copy of the amendment, so essentially, because my colleague has a problem with the definition of public spaces, which means public spaces, it's very broadly defined on page 5, lines 1 through 9. She wants to add legislative spaces because the broad definition isn't broad enough to include legislative spaces. And since it's offered as a serious amendment, I have to say that, you know, we've heard a lot of people here today and suffering from a lot of pain. You know, we've had people cry because of what they're experiencing. And this isn't a laughing matter. And because it's being offered in all seriousness, I want to say that this is an amendment that I don't know if, what the design of it is, but this amendment is offensive because public space is already very broadly defined. And I find it to be a joke, and we shouldn't be joking with people who are already destitute and looking towards this body for some help. And I ask for a no vote.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I have to agree with my co-sponsor. One, it's unnecessary because this would already be encapsulated under section 7 on page 5, line 1. However, I also find this to be hostile and offensive, given what we've heard here tonight. And to make light of that through this amendment, even though it's being offered in all seriousness, is disturbing. Now I'll leave it at that.
I didn't ask for a vote, I opposed the amendment.
Further discussion, Representative Singh?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to repeat some statements that were made earlier. Our esteemed chair said, "This is the people's house. This is your house." So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. It should be good for us too. I urge a yes vote on this amendment.
Thank you. And you are cloaked with the dignity and the respect of a state legislator, and to comport oneself in that manner. And so no, the goose isn't good for the gander. The people come here to talk to us, and to complain to us, and to ask us for help. And we are to show them the dignity and the respect of our office. So you are to rise above whatever you heard here today from the people who came to this house asking you for help. And not to make bombastic or unnecessary amendments. These people here, look at them. Look at them. They came here in good faith. So no, the goose isn't good for the gander.
Representative Nelson.
Hey, Madam Chair, the language of the bill, public space means any property that is owned in part or in whole or in part by a state or local government entity. That would cover the Capitol, that would cover the legislative offices, that would cover my office, that would cover your office. This language is unnecessary.
Representative Singh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just want to make sure, so this language you think is already included in the bill, and therefore the amendment is unnecessary, not hostile.
I think we already have, ready for a vote, please?
Representative Arndt,
No.
Anderson,
No.
Klingensmith.
No.
Navarro. Ransom. Rosenthal.
No.
Singh.
Yes.
Singer.
Respectfully, no.
Thurlow. No. Ledbetter.
No.
Madam Chair.
Now, that amendment fails and the count is 2-9. 2-9. Representative Singer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we're in the home stretch here. I move amendment L007.
L007 has been moved. Do I have a second?
Second.
Tell us about L007.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be brief with this because this is a bill sponsor's amendment, but it clarifies some of the concerns that were brought up with institutions of higher education and who would have access to what parts of an institution of higher education where. There are everything from computer labs to biology labs that are there that are meant for students and professors, not necessarily the general public. And I believe that this amendment really clarifies that and assures that a space is being used for its intended purpose and not something else.
Questions on L007? Is there an objection to Representative Anderson?
Not objection, I just had a quick addition. I think what we were also trying to get at is, in the bill, it allows cities and different jurisdictions to close open spaces when they need to. So, for example, around a festival or other instances that have been brought up, and then it's the law enforcement's ability to deal with that as they can. There are some buildings and places on college campuses, public college campuses in particular, that are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because the students or the faculty need to access them. And so we just wanted to acknowledge that I will be in favor of this personally, because that was sort of what we were trying to get at, and it seems to be a legitimate concern, and we're trying to get closer to it. So that was one other piece of that. And also, I was one of those students that had to access my studio at all hours of the day and then get up in the morning and go to my science class. So, yeah. Anyway, that's that. Thank you.
Say that this is a friendly amendment because many of these facilities are supplemented with student fees. This carve out is appropriate.
Further discussion? Seeing none, Representative Singh?
Thanks, Madam Chair. I object because I don't think homelessness stops at 5 p.m. or any other hour.
We have an objection to L007, so let's call the roll for the vote.
Representative Arndt,
Yes.
Guess who I'm
Anderson.
lobbying every day, all day for a long
Pass.
time, willing to annoy her.
Navarro. Ransom.
Yes.
Rosenthal.
No.
Singh.
No.
Singer.
Yes.
Thurlow.
No.
Klingensmith.
Yes.
Navarro.
No.
Ledbetter.
Yes.
Madam Chair.
Yes. That amendment passes and the count is 7-4. Are there any other amendments to House Bill 1191? Seeing no, the amendment phase is closed.
As amended with the favorable recommendation.
It's been moved and seconded by Representative Singer. Before we take final action on this bill, do we have,